If you were to write a movie script about the life of Captain Winkle Brown, most directors would reject it for being too unrealistic. His life wasn't just a career, it was a front-row seat to the most violent and transformative century in human history. Long before he became a legend in the cockpit, he was a man who stared death in the face and didn't blink. He was a survivor of the HMS Audacity, a carrier that was torpedoed and sunk in the freezing, oil-slicked waters of the Atlantic. He was one of only 2 pilots to survive that night, treading water in the dark while a U-boat surfaced nearby to survey the carnage. But the Atlantic was just the beginning. Brown was a man of high intellect and linguistic skill, speaking such fluent German that he was once interrogated by the Gestapo at the outbreak of World War II, only to be released because they couldn't believe an Englishman could sound so much like a native. Later, he would be one of the first Allied officers to enter the gates of Bergen-Belsen, witnessing the absolute depths of human depravity. These experiences didn't break him. They forged a cold, analytical resolve that he would soon apply to a different kind of danger, the bleeding edge of aviation technology. By the time the war ended, Brown was not just a pilot, he was the greatest test pilot in history. While other men spent their lives mastering a single airframe, Brown was a polymath of the skies. He was the man the Allies sent to fly the planes that were designed to kill them. He didn't just fly Spitfires and Hurricanes. He flew the captured, experimental, and often lethal wonder weapons of the Third Reich. He was the first human to experience the terrifying power of jet and rocket propulsion without a manual, often flying aircraft that had killed the very German pilots who helped build them. The setup for Winkle, a nickname given to him because of his short, 5 feet 7 inches stature, was simple. If it had wings and an engine, or a rocket, he would be the first to find its breaking point. He was the bridge between the age of the biplane and the age of the supersonic jet. In the following sections, we will explore how this small man with nerves of steel survived the suicide rockets of the Nazis and set records in naval aviation that will never, under any circumstances, be broken. He didn't just fly 487 different types of aircraft. He tamed them. The secret weapon of Winkle Brown wasn't just his steady hands, it was his mind. Before the war, Brown had been an exchange student in Germany, where he witnessed the 1936 Berlin Olympics and even took flying lessons from some of the future legends of the Luftwaffe. He spoke fluent, accentless German, a skill that transformed him from a mere pilot into a high-stakes intelligence asset. When the war ended and the Allies launched Operation Lusty to seize Nazi aeronautical secrets, Brown was the man they sent into the lion's den. He didn't just look at the captured planes. He interviewed the men who built them. Brown sat across from Willy Messerschmitt, the designer of the legendary Bf-109, and Ernst Heinkel, the pioneer of jet flight. Because he spoke their language and understood their physics, he could extract the nuances of a plane's personality that a translator would miss. He wasn't just collecting data, he was absorbing the souls of these machines. This gave him a unique, almost supernatural advantage when he climbed into the cockpits of captured wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, that were theoretically lethal to their own pilots. Physically, Brown was an unlikely hero. At 5 feet 7 inches, he was small enough that he often had to use cushions to reach the rudder pedals of the massive German bombers. But his stature was an asset in the cramped, experimental cockpits of the early jet age. He possessed a pathological calmness. While other pilots approached new aircraft with bravado, Brown approached them with a clipboard. He was a pioneer of quantitative test piloting. He would meticulously calculate stall speeds, wing loading, and center of gravity before the wheels ever left the tarmac. He knew that in a test flight, the difference between a successful landing and a crater in the ground was often a single mile per hour. His nerves of steel were put to the ultimate test when he was tasked with flying the Me-163 Komet. This wasn't just a plane, it was a manned rocket powered by T-Stoff and C-Stoff, 2 highly volatile chemicals that, if they touched human skin, would dissolve it instantly. The Komet was known to explode on the runway or dissolve its pilots in mid-air if a fuel line leaked. Days before Brown was scheduled to fly it, he watched a Komet disintegrate during a test. Most men would have walked away. Brown simply checked his calculations, adjusted his cushions, and climbed into the cockpit. He believed that the only way to truly understand a machine was to push it to the edge of its existence, and he had the cold, linguistic, and mathematical precision to do it and survive. Of all the 487 aircraft Eric Brown flew, the Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet was the one that truly defied death. It was the only rocket-powered fighter ever to see combat, but fighter was a generous term. It was essentially a flying combustion chamber. The fuel, a terrifying mixture of T-stuff, hydrogen peroxide, and C-stuff, hydrazine hydrate, was so corrosive that pilots had to wear specialized asbestos fiber suits just to sit in the cockpit. If the tanks ruptured in a crash, the fuel wouldn't just burn the pilot, it would literally dissolve his flesh and bones into a liquid slurry before he could scream. Brown knew this. He had seen the German casualty reports. He knew the Komet had killed more of its own pilots in accidents than it had shot down Allied bombers. Yet, under orders to evaluate the Nazis' most advanced tech, Brown climbed into the cockpit at Husum in 1945. The takeoff was a violent, primitive experience. The Komet didn't have traditional landing gear. It sat on a jettisonable dolly. As Brown opened the throttle, the rocket motor ignited with a roar that shook the earth, and the plane accelerated with a G-force that pinned him into his seat. He was off the ground in seconds, jettisoning the wheels which bounced dangerously high behind him. He then pulled the nose into a near-vertical climb, screaming toward the stratosphere at a rate of 16,000 feet per minute. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was one of extreme sensory overload. The roar of the rocket was deafening, and the cockpit filled with the pungent, acrid smell of the volatile fuels. But the real danger began when the fuel ran out. Once the motor cut, the Komet became a heavy, unpowered glider with the aerodynamic profile of a bat. Brown had to navigate this lead sled back to the runway for a one-shot landing on a retractable metal skid. There were no go-arounds. There was no engine to save him if he overshot the field. If the skid hit the ground too hard, the impact could spark a fire in the residual fuel dregs, turning the cockpit into a blast furnace. Brown brought the Komet down with the surgical precision that would become his trademark, sliding across the grass to a halt. When he climbed out, the German ground crews, who had stayed behind to assist the British, were in a state of shock. They had never seen an Allied pilot master their most temperamental devil's sled on the first try. Brown, however, simply walked to his flight log and recorded the data. To him, the Komet wasn't a suicide machine, it was just another set of variables to be solved. While Winkle Brown's exploits in captured Nazi rockets were the stuff of legend, his true crisis point happened much closer to home, on the pitching, grease-slicked deck of a British Royal Navy aircraft carrier. By 1944, Brown had become the Navy's premier test pilot, and he was handed a task that the greybeards at the Admiralty said was a death sentence. He was ordered to land a de Havilland Mosquito on a carrier. At the time, the Mosquito was one of the fastest and most powerful twin-engine aircraft in the world. It was made of wood, powered by two massive Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, and, crucially, it was never meant to land on a ship. The standard wisdom of the era was that twin-engine planes were too heavy, too fast, and too unstable for carrier operations. If one engine failed during the approach, the asymmetric thrust would flip the plane over instantly, plunging the pilot into the sea. Furthermore, the Mosquito's landing speed was so high that it was expected to simply snap the arrestor wires and plow into the ship's island. Brown didn't just disagree, he bet his life on the math. On March 25, 1944, flying the HMS Indefatigable, Brown lined up his approach. The deck looked like a postage stamp in the middle of a churning gray ocean. As he came in, the sheer size of the Mosquito's wingspan seemed to swallow the entire width of the carrier. The flight deck crew stood back, bracing for a fireball. Brown had to fly a curved approach, keeping the deck in sight until the last possible second, then kicking the rudder straight and cutting the throttles. The impact was violent. The tailhook caught the wire, and the 15,000-pound wooden bomber was jerked to a halt in a matter of feet, the airframe groaning under the stress. It was the first time in history a twin-engine aircraft had landed on a ship. Brown didn't just do it once. He took off and did it again 7 more times that day just to prove it wasn't a fluke. This was the foundation of his most untouchable world record: 2,407 carrier landings. To put that in perspective, a modern naval aviator might retire with 500 or 600. Brown's record was built on the back of thousands of traps, each one a high-speed collision with a moving deck. His spine was compressed, his neck was constantly strained by the G-forces, and his eyes were permanently tuned to the flicker of the landing lights. He held the record not just because he was skilled, but because he possessed a psychological stamina that allowed him to treat the most dangerous maneuver in aviation as a routine office job. He turned the impossible into a repeatable science, and in doing so, he paved the way for the multi-engine jet carriers of the modern era. When the dust finally settled on the 20th century, Eric Winkle Brown didn't just retire. He entered the Guinness World Records with a tally that seems mathematically impossible. He had flown 487 different types of aircraft. To be clear, that doesn't mean 487 individual planes. It means 487 entirely distinct models. To Winkle, a Spitfire Mark I and a Spitfire Mark V were the same type. If he had counted every sub-variant, the number would have been in the thousands. His logbook was a literal encyclopedia of flight. He flew everything from the Heinkel Me-162 Spats, a wooden jet built by slave labor, to the Sikorsky R-4, the world's first mass-produced helicopter. He even flew the bizarre Vought V-173 Flying Pancake, a disc-shaped aircraft that looked more like a UFO than a Navy fighter. He was the man the Americans called when they had a plane so temperamental their own pilots wouldn't touch it. He was the man the British called when they needed to know if a supersonic future was even possible. But the most incredible part of Brown's resolution wasn't the numbers. It was his longevity. Most test pilots of his era died in their 20s or 30s, vaporized in a cockpit or lost at sea. Brown lived to be 97 years old. He survived the transition from fabric-covered biplanes to the Mach 2 supersonic age, and he did it without ever losing his edge. In his 90s, he was still being visited by modern F-35 pilots who wanted to know how he handled high-alpha maneuvers or carrier approaches in heavy seas. He was a living bridge between the Wright brothers and the digital age. When he finally passed away in 2016, he was mourned as the pilot's pilot. He had spent his life solving the deadliest equations in the sky, and he did it with a humble, almost detached professionalism. He didn't seek fame, he sought the data. He proved that the greatest weapon a pilot has isn't his reflexes or his bravery, it's his ability to remain cold and analytical when the wings start to vibrate and the engine begins to scream. He was the man who literally wrote the book on how to survive the impossible, and his record of 487 types is a monument that will likely stand forever, as modern aviation has become too specialized and too expensive for any one human to ever dominate the skies like Winkle Brown. The legacy of Eric Winkle Brown is woven into the very fabric of every modern cockpit. When a pilot today lands an F-35 on a carrier or engages the afterburners on a Typhoon, they are using flight envelopes that were first mapped out by a 5'7" Scotsman with a clipboard. Brown didn't just fly these planes. He translated their mechanical violence into a language that engineers could use to build safer, faster, and more efficient machines. He was the man who survived the era of the Great Craters, the brutal period of the 1940s and 50s where a test pilot died nearly every week. But why did Winkle survive when so many of his peers, men who were just as brave and just as fast, ended up as names on a memorial wall? His personal philosophy was rooted in meticulous preparation over bravado. He once said that a pilot who relies on his reflexes is already half dead. He believed that every crash was the result of a pilot being surprised by his machine. Consequently, he spent hours studying blueprints and talking to mechanics before he ever touched a control stick. He treated flight not as a thrill, but as a high-stakes investigation. This analytical approach directly influenced the space race. When NASA began training the original Mercury 7 astronauts, they looked to the test flight protocols established by Brown and his contemporaries at Farnborough and Patuxent River. His data on high-G carrier landings and the psychological stress of one-shot rocket flights provided the baseline for what a human body could endure. In a very real sense, the path to the moon was paved by the data Brown collected while screaming toward the stratosphere in a Nazi suicide rocket. Even in his final years, Brown remained a guardian of aviation's soul. He was a vocal advocate for the human in the loop, warning that as flight became more automated, pilots were losing the feel for the air that had saved his life 100 times over. He wasn't just a record breaker. He was a philosopher of the sky. Today, Winkle Brown's legacy is preserved in the Eric Brown Collection, a treasure trove of flight logs and technical notes that remain required reading for test pilots. He is the only man to have flown both the first jet and the most advanced supersonic fighters, spanning the entire evolution of the jet engine. He remains the gold standard of what it means to be a pilot, a perfect blend of courage, curiosity, and cold, hard logic. No one will ever fly 487 types of aircraft again, not because the pilots aren't brave enough, but because there will never be another man like Eric Brown to show them how it's done.